Hello, everyone. I continue the series that we were discussing earlier on logic. And today we're going to be discussing a lot of new things. We're going to talk about tautologies, but also continue with the more examples of what we were discussing in the previous video, which I will link down below. But first, I was walking this earlier today, and there's a bookstore that I really like near my place of residence, and I found by just coincidence. I often like to browse and see what they've got, and I found I normally don't read fiction because I like real things, but and I normally don't have time for fiction. We already have a lot of fiction in America, especially in our news networks. Most of the news we get is fiction, and it's nothing more. I mean, all you have to do is look at CNN, excuse me, for example, to see that it's more of a political propaganda. Even the New York Times. The New York Times has always been, for as long as I can remember. Even I remember in the '90s, I was in high school and I denounced the New York Times. And my history teacher, he wasn't very happy about that. He was a shill for the Democrat Party, and I was never a shill for anybody except God. That's the only thing I care about. I care about truth. I don't care if you're a Republican, Democrat, but he was very much into the dark side, we'll say. But anyway, I found this. If a title catches my attention, I will pick up the book. And I found something that caught my attention only because it takes place, even though it's fiction, it actually is based on truth. And it takes place here in Virginia. And it's called let's see if you can see it here. What's it called here? The Last Confederate. The Last Confederate. And it says in the back, they have a description here. It says, the war that separated the nation pitted Winslow against Winslow. It says, Skye and Rebecca Winslow have bucked the tide of Western migration. They make their way back from Oregon City. They settle and prosper on a plantation in Virginia, where they begin to raise a family. Then a young northerner named Thad Novak makes his way to the Winslow plantation and is taken on as a hired hand. What caused him to specifically seek out the Winslows? Should he be trusted? And with young ladies in the home, what are his motives? While the nation totters on the brink of war, both Thad Novak and the Winslow boys face conscription into fighting for a cause they do not support, and directly against Winslow relatives from the north. Now, I began reading. The beginning of the book starts with the House of Winslow, and I began reading the book. It starts out on part one. It's called The Yankee. It's called The Yankee, and then it starts out with The Fugitive. It starts here with The Fugitive, and there's a lot of good. Even though, like I said, it's fiction, obviously, but I've already started to read it. It's not a bad book, actually. It's actually quite interesting here. Let me see if I can pull up one of the. No, I didn't underline it. I normally underline things but it reminded me in a way, because it reminded me when I started reading the first chapter. It kind of reminded me of me. Now, you might be surprised at this, some of you, because you might not see me as a fugitive, but I do consider myself to be a fugitive in a way. A fugitive not from justice, although the way things are going, maybe Christians in some near future will have to be fugitives, because the way things are going with society, we don't have a guarantee in America that we are always going to be protected by the First Amendment. We don't know that. But I meant more, I consider myself more a fugitive in the sense of that I've always tried to go my own way, right? And the Winslows here, Thad Novak, sort of reminds me of a situation. He ends up in Virginia, sort of like me. I am originally from the northeast of the United States. Some of you have guessed that actually accurately. I'm originally from the northeast of the United States, although I always say if I compare it to a marriage, I sort of married the South, right? If the South were a lady, that would be the lady I marry. And not because of nothing to do with the Civil War or anything like that. It's just I just happen to feel a lot better in many ways in the southern states, and that has to do because most of the reasons have to do with the fact that the southern states have been more active in defending history, in defending even though defending their own history. But I am not a southerner. I am originally from the north, and that is what they call around here a Yankee. But I never shy away from my origins, of course, and I find it kind of amusing actually because there have been a lot of stories about people from the north, especially the New England area, the Northeast, who move. Actually, Virginia is a very historically has always been a state that has been a crossroads between Northerners and Southerners, right? So that has always that has had an impact on the way I see things. But I always felt an allure, even when I was a young child. If you asked members of my family when we would drive around the country and you just cross the South, especially the deep South, because Virginia is not the deep South, but if you go further south, I'm talking about states like South Carolina, Georgia, those areas, even parts of North Florida. I always felt an attraction to some of the cultural aspects, we'll say, of the Deep South and the South in general. So, and another thing I quite like that I'm always reminded I'm in the South is that, we're in the middle of, we're now in February. Today's the 1st of February, and the temperature right now is 54. And next week, the highs are going to be in the 60s, the low 60s, 62. For the next 10 days, there is not a single day for the next 10 days where you have freezing temperatures. So I certainly don't miss. But the other day, when we had that Arctic blast, I felt more like at home. I say, oh, this is the winter. These are the winters that I remember from up north. I certainly don't miss them though. So anyway, but this video is going to be about, we're going to continue the logic section. Thank you all once again. I have to say thank you for everyone. We are now, again, this is just something I cannot predict anything anymore. I used to have an idea of how many subscribers I was going to get, but now it's just like 2 days ago, 10,000. Right now, it's pretty much above 11,000 and counting. I don't know. I've lost count of how many subscribers I have. But thank you all. Praise God for this. And I keep you all in my thoughts. I try to respond, as you've seen, to all the comments. You've all seen that I try to respond. I try to respond to as many as I can. But you got to remember, some of you, if you ask me a very long question, I'm not always going to be able to respond to very long questions because the nature of the comment section is that it's supposed to be like brief things. I've tried to respond to a few people. I responded to a young man early today, this morning, who had asked me about, he asked for guidance because he's struggling with being a young man in college. So I feel I have a special ministry and burden for those young college men. But if I don't respond to you, trust me, I try to read as much as I can. I'm a reader. So I try to read as many comments as possible. But if I don't respond to you, it's nothing personal. It's just that I can't keep up. I'm a human being and I just cannot. There is no human way to keep up. But you do have my address. You can always write to me. I'm not afraid. The other day, a gentleman said to me, it was very funny. He said, "How can you give people your address? Why do you give people your mailing address?" I said, are you on Facebook? I mean, you open up yourself on Facebook to strangers all the time. I'm not afraid of, a nice letter, a nice written letter. I'm not afraid of a nasty letter either. I've gotten those too. But I'm not afraid of defending what I stand for because I believe in truth. And so, to those of you who have subscribed, like I said, I really, really, really appreciate you all. You are just, I don't deserve, actually, I don't feel I deserve your support because low tech, right? I've always been conscious of how low tech I am. And to the gentleman who said to me that it didn't matter, thank you so much for that. That really means a lot to me. But I try to do my best with the low tech. I'm not into the special effects, the distractions, all of that we see today. It's just not my style. I'm sorry. I know some people like that, but it's just if I did something like that, I would not be. It would not me. It would not be me being honest with my subscribers, right? And I prize honesty honesty, I know it sounds like a cliche, but I always say honesty is the best policy, isn't it? And what you see with me is what you get, right? I have no filter. And some people like that, some people don't. Some people don't like the truth. Like I said, some people feel very offended when you tell them the truth. But I consider you to be my friends. And I believe that it is my duty as a Christian man to be honest. And if somebody asks me a question and they genuinely want to know the answer, they will appreciate that I am honest with the person. Right? If you tell me that, if you ask me something and I might be wrong, I'm not saying I'm always right, God forbid, right? There's no such thing as a human being who is 100% right all of the time. But you will get an honest answer from me. If you tell me the other day, I met a person the other day, and they had a huge tattoo on them. And they noticed I was kind of looking, and the man looked at me. He said, "You don't like my tattoo?" I said, "No, I actually don't like your tattoo." It's an opinion. You may like it, you may disagree with it, you may think it's horrible, but I'd rather say that than say, "Oh, it looks nice." And that's just being fake, and it's being a liar. And I would think that most of you would prefer a friend who told you what was on their mind rather than lied to you. I think lying to someone is the ultimate disrespect. It is offensive, and I think most people, even people who may not agree with me, I think that they will appreciate that I try to be honest. I'm not saying I'm correct all the time. I cannot be, because no human being is correct all the time. But I think that you will appreciate the effort that I make in telling you the way, saying things the way I see them. So anyway, here goes. We're going to talk about tautologies first, and then we're going to give some examples of things that you've asked me in the past. All right. So we were talking about in our previous videos. I mentioned the word tautology, and a tautology is really a statement where it's really a compound statement that is true in all cases. A famous example would be something like, and we hear it all the time, things like a convicted criminal, right? But there are many others that we will be looking at, and they really are very useful. These tautologies in changing a statement from one form into an equivalent statement and a different, and your objective should be hopefully to be a simpler form, right? So I gave some examples here that you can think about, where we can think about negation. And we talked about a little bit about negation when we did the truth tables in a previous video. So why don't we write out a negation of each of these statements here, and you let me know what you think. Pause the video, write them out, the negations, and then let me know, right? Did you pause the video? All right, so we have 7 is prime, or 2 plus 2 is 4. So how can we write the negation of this? Well, obviously 7 is not prime, and 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. Then the second statement, if M is bounded, then M is compact. Well, then that means the negation would be if M is bounded, and M is not compact. If roses are red and violets are blue, then I love you. Well, roses are red and violets are blue, but I do not love you. Although technically I am commanded by God, God says, love thy enemy. Love thy enemy. Although there's a lot of confusion these days as to what love means. A lot of people think love nowadays in modern, they think that love means acceptance. Love does not mean acceptance. Love means the truth, the sharing of the truth. I often hear when I criticize something, people say, what if you had a child? What if you had a son or a daughter who was like that? What would you think of that? And I always respond to, I said, there is no, it's an illogical statement. There is no requirement that a parent has to love everything their children, all the actions of their children. That's ridiculous. That is so stupid. Do you all love the actions of your parents, for example? You may respect your parents, you may love your parents. That doesn't mean you have to accept every action that they do. In fact, there is no command in the Bible the Bible says, honor thy father and thy mother. It doesn't say love all the actions that your father and your mother do. Right? We don't have to love all the actions. Especially not if we interpret love as like. Right? Love has its priorities. So that's one of the sources of confusion. But anyway, let's continue with the mathematical principles. All right. Now, the following are some tautologies that could be helpful. There are many, and you don't have to memorize them all. But I figured I'd share with you some that you can think about. Right. So let's look at the first one. The first one says we could use a mathematical example. Right? And remember that you need the previous videos. If you don't understand these symbols, you really need to look at the previous videos. These videos are all part of a series on logic that you can click on this channel. So we can think of this as, let's say, let P represent X is even, and Q represent X is divisible by 2. If X is even, then it's equivalent to saying X is divisible by 2. And if X is divisible by 2, then X must be even, right? Remember, we have P and Q statements. So that means both directions must hold true for P and Q, right? A verbal way, perhaps, that you can say this, if you say something like, well, you should marry a good Christian woman if she is worthy, that's no different from saying she should marry you if you're worthy. It's a two-way street, gentlemen. The second example here that we have is we can let P represent, let's say, I don't know, I'm trying to think, X is divisible by 3, right? I should write it out, actually. I'm just giving a mathematical example of how you could translate this. And we could let Q represent X is divisible by 6. Well, if X is divisible by 3, then it is divisible by 6. And if X is not divisible by 3, that's the negation symbol there. By 3, I should say, not 6. Then it is also not divisible by 6. So the two directions of implication hold true for PQ. You want a verbal example? I'll give you a verbal because I know some of you are verbal. You say you'll attend church every Sunday if you're truly devout. Well, if you're not there on Sunday, I dare say you're not devout at all. Just like if you're not upholding the moral values, you certainly can't claim to be a pillar of the community. All right, let's look at the third one. Here we can look at this as sort of like we can let P here represent a statement, We could say x is divisible by 4. And from here, we could say q. Let's q represent x is divisible by 2. So if x is divisible by 4, then it must also be divisible by 2. So, and then we have to think of the contrapositive is if x is not divisible by 2, then obviously it is not divisible by 4. Right? Sort of like if you say a verbal example, trying to think, you're running for office, for political office, and you promise to restore tradition, but then you falter under pressure. So don't be surprised when we say, well, if you don't keep your word, maybe you never were fit to lead in the first place. We have countless number of examples like that all across this country. This country has a sort of a junkyard of men who are like that, and women too. People who don't keep their word, people who are flaky in their character. They are not to be trusted. They tell you one thing one day, they'll tell you they'll meet you the next day, they never show up. We have a bankruptcy of character in this country, for sure. And each year, I've been around for more than 4 decades. And I can say that as long as I can remember, it gets worse every decade. All right, what about number 4? Number 4. Well, if you look at this in logical terms, for any statement P, you could think of, like, let's say x is greater than 0, whatever that. Either P is true or it's negation, meaning that x is less than or equal to 0. So this is what we call a tautology. It is the law of the excluded middle, and it holds for any proposition. So, I mean, this one is just sort of like what I said. And then in verbal, you could say you're either a man of principle or you're one of those who change their beliefs depending on what's in fashion. You cannot be both. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, cannot be an honorable man and a dishonorable man all at once. He is not both. He's certainly a dishonorable man, for sure. He's certainly not a man of principle. He changes his beliefs based on the political winds of the moment. There's a lot of men like this. Nothing new in history. There's a lot of men like that too. Or there are men who wash their hands of the affair. Pontius Pilate did that. I wash my hand. I don't want to get involved. There's a lot of men like that in America and in the world. What about number 5? Like I said, these are just some examples, but there are many. I could go on and on. But what about a mathematical example for number 5? Well, maybe we can here let P represent x is an even number. This one I want to write out. And of course, the negation of that, the negation of P can represent x is odd. And if you think about that, we talked about conjunction and disjunction. The conjunction in this case is a contradiction, right? No number, no number can be both even and odd at the same time. So this is an example of a contradiction. Right? For example, you can, and verbally you can say something like, you cannot claim to support, let's say, a traditional, I guess, family structure and then support divorce on the other. That is a contradiction. Just like the idea of freedom without responsibility. It's all a fairy tale. And we have a lot of people like that today who they confuse freedom with anarchy. They think, for example, that the First Amendment gives them the right to traffic in pornography because they believe that there should be no standards at all. No standards at all. So we could say number six is number five rather, is a contradiction. And we want to avoid contradictions, especially in math, but in life in general. All right, what about number six? Well, here we can say, let's say x is the p part. We could say x is divisible by 5. And we could say c is a contradiction. Something like saying like x is divisible by 7, but not divisible by 5. If x is not divisible by 5, this leads, of course, to a contradiction once again. And therefore, the only consistent situation is that x must be divisible by 5. Right? So I'm going to write that down too, just because it's a little bit more involved. We could say something like, let P and then we said that C is a contradiction, right? The C part. So if x is not divisible by 5, then you can conclude that it is a contradiction. All right, what about number, actually, let's think of a verbal example for number 6. What about, it's rather like saying something like, I don't believe, there's a lot of people who might say, I don't believe in hard work, but they're about to encounter a harsh reality because without hard work, you might just be dreaming, and that dream can turn into a nightmare. What about number 7? Here we can let P represent, again, divisibility, right? X is divisible by 4. And we could say Q, we could say X is divisible by 2. If X is divisible by 4, but not divisible by 2, for example, you would create a contradiction. You'd create a contradiction because divisibility by 4 always implies divisibility by 2. So this statement, P and Q, is equivalent to P or not the negation of Q. If you say that freedom is good, but you fail to teach the next generation its value, you're really heading for a contradiction, really, at least in your actions, because freedom without principles will lead to chaos. What about numbers 8 and 9? 8 and 9. I leave those to you, but number 8, you can think of it as a deductive. You can conclude with a deductive principle. And number 9, you can think about it as an implication. And the implication will create a must condition. But have a look and see what you think. Now, the next part of this is now we're going to get into the mathematical laws that we didn't talk about in our previous video. All right, so hopefully you can see on the board now, we have a theorem here. We're going to illustrate this as an indirect proof of an existential statement. So we have a theorem here that says, let f be a continuous function. If p states that the integral from 0 to 1 of f of x with respect to x is not equal to 0, and q states there exists a number x in the closed interval from 0 to 1 such that f of x is not 0. Now we can rewrite this using the contrapositive. Instead of proving P implies Q, you can prove not Q implies not P. And that's often much easier, isn't it? So in reality, this means that we're proving if for every x in the interval from 0 to 1, f of x is exactly 0. And then the integral from 0 to 1 of f of x is also 0. And there you have it. There's no need to search for some elusive x where the function behaves differently. The function is 0 everywhere. And so, quite obviously, its total contribution to the integral is also 0. It's simple, it's direct, and it's undeniable. But further along down the road, we will be discussing Riemann sums in much greater detail. If you were able to recognize a Riemann sum, you'll know that there's a lot more to say. Now, the next thing that we are going to, so this was an indirect proof by an existential statement. The next thing that we have to prove, a student asked me in the comments section in the previous video, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, doesn't matter, but I'm just going to assume he asked me to prove the following. The student was working on a problem that asked the following question. So the student asked me, they said that they are I guess the equivalent of an honor student in the UK, I believe. Student asked, could you please perhaps explain the proof by contradiction that there are infinite number of prime numbers? So we could engage in a classic demonstration of how foolish assumptions can lead to undeniable truths. Suppose for a moment that the list of prime numbers were finite. Yes, let's humor for a second the idea. You take them all, you multiply them together, and you add 1, and what do you get? A number that defies all reason. And it is either a prime greater than our so-called complete list, or it refuses to be divided by any of them. A paradox, a disaster. And so we are left with but one conclusion. Our original assumption was nonsense. The prime numbers march on, infinite, untamed, and beyond the grasp of our feeble attempts to list them all. However, on a more serious note, we can assume the opposite. Again, the question was proof by contradiction that there are infinite number of prime numbers. So why don't we assume the opposite, right? That's the contradiction. We can assume for the sake of contradiction that there are only a finite number of prime numbers. So let's say that there are exactly n, we'll just call it n prime numbers, and we would list them all. So if there were only 5, let's say, prime numbers, you could have 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Your goal is to prove that this assumption leads to a contradiction, which it'll show that your original assumption must be false, right? So let's kind of organize this. we're going to say that there are exactly n prime numbers. And if that's the case, we would list them. You could say prime number 1, prime number 2, prime number 3, all the way, just say P2 and P3, and all the way up to, you get the point. All that we normally, when it's in sequence like this, we just put an N here that indicates that we're continuing. So, like I said, if there were only 5 prime numbers, you could have, let's say, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. And if that's the case, we're going to prove that this assumption is going to lead to a contradiction. So we now have to construct, obviously, a new number. We can now define a new number. We call it P as follows, right? We could use the sequence that we have above and add 1 to it. All right. So what this is saying is we can, let's say, multiply. I should put a little star here. So if we multiply all the primes together and then add 1, so why don't we take the first few primes, obviously, right? 2 times 3 times 5 times 7. If we do all of those numbers, and see what you get from that. You can pause the video and see what you get. Let's see, 2 times 3, 6, 6 times 5, 30, 30 times 7, right? And then 30 times 7 times 11 plus 1. So that's going to give me, let me see on scrap paper here. 2 times 3 times 5, 7. All right, you should be getting, and you can correct me because I don't use calculators, but I'm getting 2,311. But always check just in case. So at this point, what about prime factorization of P? Now, if you analyze P, we're saying P, we can say it's larger than any of our assumed prime numbers. So either it's going to be a new prime number itself, and that would contradict our assumption that we listed all the primes, or you could have a composite number, which obviously is a composite number is not a prime number. So that means it has to be divisible by some prime number on your list. So, but none of your original primes can divide P. But why is that? Well, P is equal to the product of all primes that we have here plus 1. And if you divide P by any prime, you're actually going to get a remainder of 1. Because of that, this means that no prime in your original list can divide P. And that contradicts the assumption that we made that we had all primes listed. So the conclusion you can come up with this is the assumption was that there are only finitely many primes, and that led to a contradiction. And therefore, the assumption must be false. That means that thus there must be infinitely many prime numbers. So I hope that helps you kind of put things in perspective to whoever asked me. If you're watching this video, there you go. That's my answer to you. So I wish you well in your mathematical studies. The next thing we're going to talk about is another proof by contradiction. All right, so let's look at this theorem here. we're going to illustrate the sheer, unforgivable folly of assuming a falsehood. We could consider sort of the following. We're going to have an airtight proof by contradiction. Let x be a real number, our theorem states. If x is greater than 0, then 1 over x is greater than 0. And symbolically, this is P implies Q. So that means P has to state that x is greater than 0, and Q states 1 over x is greater than 0. Now, as we all know, if you're making logical statements, they have to obey certain unshakable truths. And those are truths that have been understood since Aristotle, and which, even though we're using symbolic logic, it's an extension of that, in which no amount of modern hand waving will ever overturn. So one such truth tells us that P implies Q. And that is a logical equivalence to what we discussed earlier when we were discussing tautologies, when we were discussing contradictions. Remember that the symbolic way of representing that. So we have to assume here the impossible if we play devil's advocate. Not that I want to ever emulate the devil. The devil actually hates me. I hope the devil hates you as well. But if we suppose here that x is greater than 0, but against all logic and sound reasoning, we're also assuming that 1 over x is less than or equal to 0. So we have no option here but to mercilessly crush this nonsense. Since x is greater than 0, we are perfectly justified. We can multiply both sides of the inequality. By the way, I made videos on inequality. You better watch those as well. We multiplied both sides of the inequality. Let's have here 1 over x is less than or equal to 0 by x, right? So in other words, see if I can write it out. I hate typing. I prefer writing. So we could do x times 1 over x, and we're making a statement that this is less than or equal to x times 0. All right. But what's going on with this? This simplifies to 1 is less than or equal to 0. And we've got a contradiction here. It's slapping us in the face. Now, unless the very fabric of reality has torn us apart, this is ridiculous, right? 1 is greater than 0. We know that from the definition of numbers. And as far as we know, has always been greater than 0, but as per our definitions, and will remain greater than 0 until the end of time, because mathematical truths are forever. So the final judgment, our original assumption, this delusional idea that 1 over x could be non-positive, has led us straight into absurdity. And we have to reject it entirely. And so we arrive at the only rational conclusion, and that is that 1 over x is greater than 0. And the theorem now stands unchallenged. What's the moral of the story then? Mathematics does not negotiate with falsehoods. Mathematics is, in fact, the language of God. And God does not trade in falsehoods, and neither should you, by the way. That's one of the main problems we have today. We have a lot of people who tolerate falsehoods. Math doesn't entertain foolishness. It's absolute because truth is absolute. Truth is also unapologetic and relentless. So I hope that this video serves the purpose that was intended to help you with proofs. Next week, we shall be discussing sets. We really need to talk about sets next week. Set notation, set theory, and all that. But I hope that this preliminary. So we've already completed basically the equivalent of a chapter 1. So hopefully that this was helpful to you all. If it was, please continue to support the mission of this channel. Please continue to subscribe. At this point, you don't really have a choice, right? Because a lot of people, and I say this in a good way, you really want those of you who value truth, those of you who value unfiltered reality and the truth as it is, you really need a channel like this one. So I hope that you continue to support me in the mission to spread the truth. Thank you all, and may you have a blessed weekend. And hopefully you're going to church tomorrow, Sunday. I hope to see, well, I won't see you physically perhaps, but I hope you're all going to be, remember my previous video, I hope you're all going to be doing something edifying or glorifying God. Thank you.